So the next talk is by Yotam Ben Moshe and Yael Maschler. It is called A Multimodal Study of Clicks at Frame Shifts in Hebrew Interaction. And let's see it. Please make sure you have your presentations ready. Okay, thank you very much. Go ahead.
Here we go. Okay, so welcome to our talk. So, languaging or using language involves continually signaling the frame through which our utterance is intended. In his study of footing, Goffman writes, "A change of footing implies a change in the alignment we take up to ourselves and the others present, as expressed in the way we manage the production or reception of an utterance. A change in our footing is another way of talking about a change in our frame for events. Participants, over the course of their speaking, constantly change their footing, these changes being a persistent feature of natural talk." And Goffman called upon linguists to provide us with the cues and markers through which such footings become manifest, helping us to find our way to a structural basis for analyzing them. Now, Yael has attempted to answer this call by showing that participants employ discourse markers at conversational action boundaries in order to construct the frame shifts taking place throughout their interaction, often by projecting the nature of these shifts. She showed systematicity in employment of discourse markers in terms of distribution, function, and structure. In this talk, we attempt to answer Goffman's call by focusing on a particular family of sounds produced during speech, clicks. We will show preliminary results from an ongoing study of the manner by which clicks are employed to mark various types of frame shift in Hebrew conversation. In this paper, we use clicks as a general term for a large number of related sounds, primarily dental clicks and bilabial clicks, but also other clicks as well as percussives, and more about all of that at the end of the talk. This paper joins a scholarly discussion that began with Melissa Wright, who was the first to look at clicks from an interactional perspective and describe the use of clicks for the segmentation of talk. The units delimited by clicks, according to Wright, were sequences as defined in conversation analytic literature, courses of action implemented through talk. Richard Ogden has also studied clicks in English, and in his paper from 2013, he suggested that there are also clicks which project an intention to speak, incipient speakership. These clicks seem to be often unintentional results of the mechanics of speech, but participants in conversation can presumably orient to them as indications of upcoming talk, whether they were produced intentionally to indicate this or not. Both authors showed that there is considerable variation in the quality of sounds found in this position. There's bilabial, labial dental, and other clicks, and Ogden described also percussives, fainter sounds produced when the organs of the mouth touch or part. Note that both of these describe other functions of clicks as well, but we won't have time to delve into those functions today. We would like to refine these findings based on our research. Building upon Ogden's characterization of clicks as part of the management of the body in preparation for talk, we'll show that clicks are found in the beginnings of new sequences in Hebrew as well, but we'll argue that we need to reconsider the units delimited by clicks. We need to describe them as, if we describe them as sequences, we only get a part of the picture. This study uses the methodology of interactional linguistics to investigate data from two corpora developed at the University of Haifa. Both of these are focused on adult native speakers in casual conversation among friends and family. Tokens were collected by careful listening. So in this talk, we would like to, first of all, contextualize varied clicks and percussives as part of a practice of managing bodily functions during interaction to make room for language and social action. Characterize the chunks of talk delimited by clicks, they're not just sequences, and demonstrate the use of clicks as part of clusters of framing devices. Let's begin with our first example. In this excerpt, Lital on the left is telling Eden about a recent meeting with her ex-boyfriend, Tom, at the bar where she works. Tom challenged her to a drinking contest, and she accepted. At this point, Lital's been reporting a conversation between the two, and following closure of this constructed dialogue, Lital takes a sip from her coffee before moving the narrative forward. And right after this sip, she produces a click. Let's watch.
ואז אמרתי לו, איזה פתיחת מטומטם, אם אתה לא מכיר, אני...
לא קוראים לי ליפז.
מה שאתה רוצה, בקיצור.
נו.
מי את חושבת שאת מזה? תקשיב, אין לי בעיה, לא אפילו יותר ממך, אני כאילו, אתה מבין, אני חסינה כבר לאלכוהול. עושה לי טוב. מגיעים לקראת סוף הערב, תקשיבי, טל, אני מגמגם.
Okay, we join in for the end of Lital's constructed dialogue between herself in the story world and her ex. At this point in the story, Lital and Tom have been drinking for a while, and Tom has been dismissive of her drinking capacity. Lital, in response, boasts that she's been drinking so much that by now she's immune to alcohol and will surely outdrink him. So she says, I told him, listen, I've got no problem drinking even more than you. You don't understand, I've become immune to alcohol. And she wraps this up with Tom's response. He goes, fine. The discourse marker Tov, translated here as fine, as described in Yael's book from 2009, is doing an ironic agreement, that is, a disagreement, while also serving to close this sequence of talk and wrap up Tom's constructed dialogue. Now Lital takes a sip from her coffee and produces an alveolar click. Not a particularly loud one, but it's there. And she frame shifts into the background for the next episode, skipping ahead in the narrative to the end of the evening. What we see here is that sipping from your coffee isn't done at any old point in the interaction. Lital chooses a point after she's completed one episode in her telling and before she launches the next one. On the one hand, we may explain this behavior within the confines of the single speaker without reference to interaction, as managing the parallel activity of drinking to minimize its interference with the story. And the presence of the click is easily accounted for in physiological terms. When we swallow, we remove material from the mouth and therefore create a pocket of low-pressure air between the tongue and the roof of the mouth. Clicks are produced exactly by creating this sort of pocket and opening it outwards. On the other hand, this behavior is systematic. We unfortunately can't show you the rest of Lital's sips. It's really a long telling, but they are repeatedly placed at frame shifts and repeatedly lead to a click. And knowing that this is a common practice in conversation, a listener can recognize that a sipping storyteller has probably reached some kind of break in the narrative. And the narrator, in turn, may sip to create this impression deliberately, rendering this interactionally motivated behavior. This is exactly the process which we think has led to clicks serving as a way of segmenting talk. Note that the sip and the click are far from being the sole indications of this transition. We mentioned the sequence closing discourse marker Tov and the setup for the next episode of the story. The sipping is just one of several cues. And let's move on to clicks produced when there is no eating or drinking to be managed alongside talk. In this excerpt, Mika is telling Yael about a night when her sleep was repeatedly disturbed by her noisy upstairs neighbor.
בשעה אחרי זה, כאילו בין 12 ל-1, היא הייתה שיכורה ופשוט דיברה בצעקות עם איזה חברה שלה בטלפון, אני לא יודעת, אין לי מושג, אבל היא דיברה ממש בקול רם. וזה היה יום לפני שהייתי אמורה להתחיל את הסמסטר, ב8:30 בבוקר, ואני כותבת לה, תקשיבי, זה ממש מוגזם, אני כאילו השעה 1, אני צריכה לקום ב6:30. די. אוי, סליחה, אני אנמיך טוב ווליום. הלכה לישון. אני הלכתי לישון. התעוררתי אחרי 2.5, ב3:30 בבוקר.
So this excerpt exhibits 3 different frame shifts involving clicks, and unlike the previous example we saw, there are significantly fewer resources devoted to these shifts, making the clicks and percussives more central to the interactional effect. So in the first shift, Mika is moving from the foreground of the narrative, the neighbors shouting, to a background detail about the semester that was supposed to begin the next day, which of course makes her inability to sleep all the more frustrating. In Lebov's terms, this is a transition from a part of the complicating action back to providing more orientation to the narrative. And between these 2 parts of the narrative, Mika breathes in through her nose, and the movement of her lips indicates she's swallowing. And there's a rather loud percussive, the sound of her tongue leaving the palate, transcribed here following Ogden as an ingressive t. At the same time, ending the previous episode, she adjusts her sitting position on the sofa. And this entire body management event and the following discourse marker ve, meaning and, right here, are the only indications of this rather subtle frame shift within the narrative. We may mention, however, that the time devoted to breathing and swallowing does create a longish stretch of time with no talk, nearly an entire second. We would prefer not to think of this as a pause in the sense of a lack of activity. Part of our point here is that there is some bodily and cognitive activity going on there, which is simultaneous with a frame shift in the narrative. Now, after Eyal's empathic laugh, Mika reports her angry text message to the neighbor, demanding that she stop making noise. As she switches to the neighbor's response to this, Mika breathes in again, although this time we don't see her swallowing, and there's a clear dental click. The break created by the body management is shorter this time, about 0.6 seconds, but still long enough to be noticeable. Another cue marking this shift is prosody, with the neighbor's response a little bit faster with lower volume. Finally, this shift is also indicated lexically by kazeh, right here, translated as like, as described in previous research, which is used here to introduce constructed dialogue, the neighbor's apology and the promise to turn down the volume. Finally, we have a frame shift that's comparable to the one we saw in the previous excerpt, a move from the constructed dialogue to reporting the next narrative event. And this time, the only indications we can identify for this frame shift are the click, which once again follows the swallowing, the switch from future to past tense, and a certain change in prosody, including increased volume and reduced tempo. Again, this creates a break of around 0.8 seconds. And note that the next intonation unit has an in-breath with no clicker percussives, which is appropriate since we're still in the same narrative episode. In Leibov's terms, again, this is the following narrative event within the complicating action. These three different frame shifts achieved with clicks demonstrate that this is a systematic practice, regardless of whether the speaker is eating or drinking while speaking. Importantly, none of the clicks here can be said to signal a new sequence. These are all part of the same sequence in conversational analytic terms, all part of the same narrative. Also note the variation in articulation, again, of these various clicks. We'll address this near the end of the talk. Let's look at one final example, this time of a major frame shift. Alon and Hillel are a couple sitting in their living room with their newborn baby. Alon is being repeatedly bringing up their plans for the coming weekend, but the discussion is being interrupted several times by the baby crying. And now Alon is feeding him, so the baby has calmed down, and Alon brings up the weekend plans once more.
זה מה שאני צריך. חלה, שילב, סידור רכב. אני חייב לסיים את זה.
So we join in while Alon is singing to the baby, and Hillel is looking down. After kissing the baby, Alon renews the conversation with an in-breath and a marked change in posture and gaze, followed by a swallow, a click, and a reversed pseudoclef. This reverse pseudoclef projects a recapitulation of his list of plans for the weekend, which indeed follows in lines 6 to 8. Hillel lifts his gaze to Alon at the very end of this reverse pseudoclef in a display of cooperation. The actions pursued before and after this click could hardly be more distinct, rendering this a major interactional frame shift. And this time we're definitely dealing with a new sequence. Once more, the click here comes as part of a set of body managing practices, an in-breath and swallowing, along with a very big change in posture, which together take up about 2 seconds in total. Importantly, this frame shift is accompanied also by a complex syntactic construction, a reverse pseudoclef, marking the recapitulation of the previous topic. Now, the examples we've seen today demonstrate that clicks are used to mark both subtle frame shifts within a larger activity, namely narrative, and major frame shifts, such as the one shown here. In themselves, the clicks are not sufficient to signal the exact character of the emerging frame shift, but we've seen that often these are constructed by using multiple resources, which may be lexical, syntactic, prosodic, or embodied. As shown in Yael's study from 1997, different types of frame shifts are characterized by different resources. So constructing a specific type of frame shift is done by selecting the appropriate cluster of linguistic and other sigmas. We've talked at length about the position of these sounds, but at this point, we'd like to address the issue of form. We've heard today alveolar and dental clicks and a percussive. The wider collection, in fact, contains a large number of bilabial clicks in this environment, and also much more complex tokens, where we can hear and see in a spectrogram several places of articulation, such as the lips parting and then the tongue leaving the palate. This is what we see in the example given here, which is taken from a major frame shift, the beginning of a narrative. The speaker announces this with, "Anyway, here's a funny story," then produces this complex sound and moves on to state the time in which the story takes place. We can hear the lips parting and then a palatal click. And these two events are also clearly visible in the spectrogram, where we have the two black lines representing two transient sounds, the first being the weaker percussive and the second being the click. Let's try to hear them. This example is representative of the wide variety of articulations found in our collection. Many of the more complex examples include percussives, which are not used phonemically in any language and are often very soft, probably inaudible for participants themselves even when there's any background noise. And these are used alongside very loud and prominent clicks. These big differences in form probably reflect the sometimes involuntary, accidental nature of these sounds. They still haven't been entirely conventionalized. They're still sometimes unintentional. Are these sounds a part of language? By most definitions of language, probably not, but they are on the verge of language. They're liminal signs, to use the term coined by Mark Dingematze. They share some of the features of spoken language. They're produced by the same organs. They thus have a place in the linguistic syntagm. And as we've seen, they are part of the design of utterances. However, they're highly unstable form, their non-phonemic status, and their lack of integration in syntax and morphology show that they have not been quite assimilated into the linguistic system. In any case, they definitely do have a significance in the interaction. Speakers strategically place them so that they support the design of their terms. Intriguingly, Hebrew clicks may be used in conversation also in much more classical linguistic functions, such as negation and negative stance taking, which we have not had time to address today. And in these contexts, we invariably find dental clicks, no percussives, no bilabials, etc. So not all clicks are liminal in the same way. To conclude, as previously described, clicks and percussives systematically occur at points of disjunction in talk. The units framed by these clicks, however, are not limited to sequences, but include also smaller units such as transitions into and from constructed dialogue, and are best conceptualized through the notion of frame shifts. The form of clicks in such positions is highly variable, probably reflecting their sometimes involuntary nature. Many of these clicks appear as part of various practices of body management, including swallowing and inhaling, which are relegated to pauses between textual segments. These activities can cause clicks to be produced involuntarily and are the environment which led to their conventionalization. And finally, in themselves, clicks do not specify the nature of the frame shift involved. Constructing a particular type of frame shift is typically done by multiple resources, including changes in posture and prosody, employment of particular discourse markers, and complex syntactic structures. The systematicity in employment of combinations of these various features awaits further study. Thank you very much, and we're eager to hear your questions.
Dorit, would you like me to ask people, or?
I'm sorry, I thought I was talking and then I had to unmute myself. Thank you again for this talk, and there is already one question.
I see that there's like 3.
Yeah, no, there are 3 comments, but 2 are on the previous talk. So Yael, would you like to take this question? Can you see it?
No, I don't have a question. I believe.
So thank you. Thank you for this very interesting talk. Do you have thoughts on which of these sounds signify frame shift and which are physiological epiphenomena, like the sipping, which is used when? In another formulation, which of the clicks are lexicalized?
So in my opinion, in these environments, when signaling frame shifts, there's always room for doubt. We can never definitely say that something, we can most of the time, we're most of the time not sure what's intentional and what's not. I'd say that the louder the click is, it's more likely to be intentional. Dental clicks, as discussed, are exclusively found in some functions, and therefore they seem to be kind of the more conventional form in Hebrew. So I'd say they are usually more intentional.
Okay, Yael Ziv, please.
And I just unmuted myself. I enjoyed the talk I heard some of it in previous context, but I'm wondering about the syntactic characterization of pseudoclefts. When you say something like "זה מה שאני צריך" is a reversed pseudocleft, the unreversed pseudocleft is not a sentence, okay? So מה שאני צריך זה מילא, but זה בדיוק מה שאני צריך. מה שאני צריך זה בדיוק is not, I think there's some misconception of the concept of reversed pseudocleft in your examples. Okay, so I think the syntactic characterization might need to be modified.
We're using reverse pseudocleft just as a conventional title for this construction, but Yael, I think, may say some initial words about the characterization of what it does in conversation.
Yeah. The function is clear, the syntax isn't. Okay, so that's just a comment. Not that you have to worry about it, but I would make sure the syntactic characterization is slightly modified.
Well, let me just add that we're using a name that we hadn't invented, and the reverse here is because there is some kind of inversion, like you'd have part. This is actually the opposite of the constructions that I showed, right? Part A, copula, part B. And here we have copula, part A, part B.
It's clear, but the reversed, unreversed version doesn't exist. Okay, that's all.
Well, I don't know. I think it does exist because
no,
you say...
בדיוק, זה בדיוק מה שאני צריך exists, but בדיוק מה שאני צריך, but מה שאני צריך זה בדיוק is not a well-formed English Hebrew sentence.
I wouldn't say that biduk is part to be here. I would say that chala, shilav, rechev is part to be.
Okay, I'm done.
Okay.
Okay.
We have just one more minute. Jack, please, go ahead.
Yes, I want to say that one of the points was that not all of these sounds are the same, and in particular the very quiet sounds, some of the bilabials, for example. I think it would be interesting to see to what extent those correlate with a long time since the person has spoken. In other words, more than just turn taking, but is this someone who has been sitting quietly while the other three people in the conversation talk? So in other words, you get sort of a transition from a resting state and of the articulators, and that's where you get some of these bilabial sounds.
Definitely. It also probably depends somewhat on the idiosyncratic resting position that someone is used to using, or what exactly they've been doing before, and so on. They are sometimes accidental, but sometimes we even get a context where it's clear that the user has had to intentionally change his conduct in order to produce the click, where he's been doing something else with his mouth, and producing a click here actually takes more effort. So they're always on the border between intentional and accidental.